No issue today will play a bigger part in shaping the world of tomorrow like the Russian-Ukraine war. No issue today is as divisive and stirs so much emotions like the Russian-Ukraine war. No issue gets as much media coverage, and yet intelligent people cannot agree on the basic facts. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Is Putin's aim to conquer Ukraine and rebuild the Russian Empire? Why was NATO so keen on expansion when so many experts had warned of the risk? Why is the Russian advance in the war so slow? Why hasn't the Russian Air Force, the second largest in the world, played a bigger role? How is the Ukrainian counteroffensive really going? What if it doesn't succeed? Can the US afford to let Zelensky lose the war? Let's dive into these crucial questions and see where hard and soft evidence and logic take us. Hi, I'm David Wu, a former IMF economist and Wall Street strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about the big story shaping our world tomorrow. Hello, everybody. I am very, very honored today to be joined by Steve Myers to talk about the Russian-Ukraine war. Steve has a very interesting background, a degree in mathematics from Stanford. He's a two-time US Air Force veteran. Okay, he's a very successful four-time CEO and a serial entrepreneur. He served 3 terms on the U.S. Department of State Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy. And interestingly, Steve was the first American since Charles Lindbergh to pilot an aircraft into the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula, where he formed one of the first post-Soviet joint ventures in the Russian Far East. And by the way, if you want to check out, his experience in the post-Soviet Russia, basically, you can get his book called Crosswinds Adventure and Entrepreneurship in the Russian Far East. So, Steve, it's such a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to join you, David.
Over the last few weeks, at least in Europe, the public support for Ukraine is waning, but the leaders have not given up and are just trying to convince there are people that we need to basically stick it out simply because we could be next if Ukraine loses this war. Now, so this is making a very strong assumption. You were quoted in a USA Today article recently as saying that you think that Russian military tactics so far in this war have been completely inconsistent with the idea of conquest. Can you please elaborate more about, what is it that you see about the Russian tactics that leads you to arrive at that conclusion?
Let me begin by sharing something with your audience so they have a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm very much a political centrist and not either anti or pro-Ukraine or Russia. So I don't feel like I have a dog in the fight. What I'm interested in is the irrationality of the actions that the West has taken that have gotten us to this, brought this war on, and have gotten the war to where it is today. I think the bottom line for me is this war never should have happened. I think it's a tragedy for Ukraine. It's a tragedy for the world. And probably the most devastating geopolitical event that's happened in the world since the end of World War II. It's got no end of unintended consequences. And I honestly think it happened because of a lot of notions like the one that you're bringing up now, which is what are Russia's intentions. Now, I've read many of Putin's speeches, and I cannot find anywhere any speech that he's giving where he's talking about, conquest of the West. He's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. He's trying to recreate the Russian Empire. That is a lot of hyperbola, I think, that's being promoted by people in the West who have a political agenda to maximize fear, to play on people's secondhand trauma from the horrific things that happened in the world during the 20th century. I think that the battlefield tactics that I've seen Russia employ at the beginning of the war, which were awful, showed no indications at all of any kind of conquest in mind. In fact, I think what they had in mind, they just went around about it in a very bad way, was really a decapitation attack on Kiev with the intention of installing their own puppet leader instead of our puppet leader. And that didn't work out too well. But something you need to understand about how the Russians roll. They always do this after the Ribbentrop-Molotov treaty was signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the purpose of which was to give both sides a pause before they started the war. Stalin discovered that the German war plan was actually to occupy a strip of land opposite what was then Leningrad and now St. Petersburg, and we're going to use an artillery barrage to destroy the city. Well, he needed that strip of land, which happened to be in Finland, so he called up the Finnish king and very politely asked if they might not work a trade, and they give them a good exchange on land if they could just have the strip of land. And the Finnish king, he was having none of it. And so they started a war. And it started off like all Russian wars. They started losing. They had bad leadership. So that was for about the first 3 months. And then the Russians did what they always do. They shot the general, they replaced the troops, they came in with an army that knew what it was doing, and the war was over in 3 more months. So in 6 months, the war was over, and Finland had lost 20% of its landmass. The deal that that Putin was trying to make with the West, if you step back and take an objective look at those 4 points, right now they're looking like they're a pretty good deal. And that's after now Ukraine's in jeopardy of losing probably 46% of its landmass. 46%. It's got 350,000 casualties. It's bankrupt. It's lost 40% of its population. Shall I go on? I mean, this is a ridiculous situation. And from a military standpoint, there's no expectation that Ukraine could possibly win this war. And we should have known that. We did know that before this started. So the real question is, what are these people thinking? If Putin is supposed to be Hitler, he's like the worst Hitler ever. What has he conquered? What exactly, what's he been doing since, 2000? The guy's been in office for 23 years. What exactly is his conquest record? It's a kind of a look. There's a lot of political statements that are made. There's a lot of propaganda, and all that does is throw dust in the air to prevent people from making up their own minds about what it is they're actually seeing. My favorite phrase about this war is, and you hear it every day in the narrative, unprovoked. Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Well, I think he was very much provoked, because I think you look, I'm not an apologist for Putin. Let's just say they're all monsters. Okay, pick a regime, pick a country, and you're just talking about degrees. So he's monster of the day. All right. The real question is, what's his job? And his job is to be the advocate for Russia. That's his job. His job is protecting the national security of Russia. Just as in the United States and in every other country in the world, their leaders have those same responsibilities. They're there to look out for the best interests of their people. They're there to look out for their economy. They're there to look out for their national security. Putin believes, down to his toenails, that Ukraine joining NATO is a national security threat to Russia that rises to the level of being an existential threat. Now, what does that mean, an existential threat? What it means is that you can be attacked and destroyed before you can counterattack. This is the moral equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but only in reverse. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had a sovereign nation, Cuba. We didn't like their nation. We weren't happy with their political leadership. That's beside the point. They had a country. They were a nation state. They made a deal with another nation state, a trade agreement, an exchange agreement. They agreed to host the Soviets in Cuba and give them land to set up bases. The Soviets imprudently, under Khrushchev, decided that they put ICBMs, intermediate range ICBMs, in Cuba. Well, that was an existential threat to the United States, and we'd have gone to nuclear war over it. And had it not been for the superb diplomatic skills of Robert Kennedy, that's probably what would have happened. What's going on here? The difference is this is basically a proxy war. And it's a proxy war because if the United States did not finance it, the United States didn't promote it, the United States didn't encourage NATO, it could not have happened. And if the war couldn't have happened, that means Ukraine and Russia would have had to sit down and work out a deal. And the conditions that Russia was asking for, I didn't think they were particularly obnoxious. Elon Musk doesn't think they're particularly obnoxious. There is a wide array of geopolitical thought leaders who thinks that this was not such a crazy idea. Great start for a talk. His number one demand is Ukraine should be neutral, not be a member of NATO. They needed a buffer. Okay. I think that's where we're going to end up anyway. If you think about that as the primary, biggest issue. Of course, the second issue was the Crimea. They're not going to give up the Crimea like ever. Okay. In fact, we forced their hand in 2014 with the coup that overthrew the Russian-friendly president of Ukraine. And that sort of set up a situation where Ukraine could right then and there fast track it into NATO. And so I think Putin's action in Crimea was about making sure that Crimea did not become a NATO base.
This started already with George Kennan. And the guy basically said that, he was completely against, essentially NATO enlargement, call it the most fateful era of U.S. policy in the entire post-Cold War era. You've got political scientists like John Mearsheimer, who holds the West responsible for the Ukraine crisis, and we've been predicted already back in 2014 that NATO enlargement will lead to war between Russia and NATO. So from that point of view, it's not like the Americans didn't see this coming. I mean, there were a lot of prominent Americans who were warning, U.S. administrations of the risk of going down this path. Yet that didn't seem to stop people from, Clinton and onwards to basically encourage NATO enlargement. In fact, the story has it that, Putin wanted to join and it was told to basically get lost. What was the motivation for Washington to insist on, NATO enlargement, especially given NATO was created to basically, to counter the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is no more. In Russia, we said before, it doesn't pose danger like the Soviet Union did. So in general, the raison d'etre of NATO has been called into question, let alone enlargement and basically pissing off the Russians and making them feel insecure.
The first thing to understand is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the real question is what is NATO's purpose? And of course, it didn't have one because its whole purpose was built around defending the West against the Soviet Union. What I see happening is NATO becoming repurposed as the military wing of the EU. That gives you a context to start to make sense out of what happens. Because now, if NATO is the military wing of the EU, NATO starts going to the former Warsaw Pact countries and saying, look, why don't you join NATO? We'll give you gear, we'll train your troops, we'll send you money, and we'll get you into the EU. Who's not going to do that? And a lot of these Warsaw Pact countries, you think about Romania, think about Poland, they hate the Russians. There is an aspect to this that no one talks about that you need to understand to make sense out of what's happened. And I've been wanting to write an essay about it, but I don't know how to end it. But here's the issue. The issue is multi-generational, unresolved trauma. All of these Warsaw Pact countries are filled with the children. Most of the of the people that lived it are gone, but not all. And their children were raised in an environment of living with the same kind of trauma the children of Holocaust survivors had to live with. And that trauma has never been resolved. And I meet people from Poland, from Romania, from other former Warsaw Pact countries, and you can feel it in the way they feel about things. This is entirely emotional, irrational, actually. They're terrified. It's a very fear-based thing. Politicians feed on that fear. When I was talking earlier about feeding on the fear, this is the fear that I'm talking about. Europe generally, and Central Europe in particular, has huge anxiety about a Russian invasion. It's not going to happen. Putin many times has talked about NATO and Article 5, and he has zero interest in having any kind of a conflict with NATO. That's one of the reasons you've seen so little of their Air Force. That's one of the reasons they've been so restrained in the way that they have dealt with Ukraine.
The question really, in my mind, that we have to resolve is, what took the Russians so long? Why were they so stuck? Is it because, basically that they were not up to the task, or that they had to learn from their mistake, like you said, Finland in the past? Or is it possible, as you were saying before, the Russians showed great restraint? They didn't want to kill civilians. They didn't want to kill too many, Ukrainians. So therefore, they didn't basically unleash their full force.
Putin is trying to walk a very tight line between not being so aggressive as to actually provoke a more aggressive counter response from the West, and not being ineffective. I think he started out giving orders on in the West. We call this rules of engagement. And I think the rules of engagement that he gave his military constrained them from doing what they needed to do to win. Why? Because he made a political calculus that was incorrect. And that political calculus was how the U.S. was going and NATO were going to react. So instead of asking themselves, why is it that they're fighting with one hand behind their back? It's, they're weak and stupid. Let's escalate the conflict, without realizing the escalation of the conflict isn't going to move, not going to change the Russians. They'll just match you. This is, if you want to have an arm wrestling contest, fine. You up at 20%, they'll up at 20%. The catastrophe is what it did to Ukraine, because every time we escalated the conflict, the response was more damage to Ukraine, more people killed in Ukraine. Ukrainian casualties are at about 350,000 right now. There was just an article, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, that was talking about 50,000 amputees and 200,000 wounded. That's 250 right there. And they've had at least 100,000 killed on top of that. Now, that is a very interesting number, 350,000. And what's interesting about it is it's the number of Americans killed in all of World War II. And we're talking about 350,000 Ukrainian casualties in 18 months. That's a crime against humanity. That's a tragedy that never should have happened. I bleed for them. I can't tell you how sad I am for them to have been placed in this position. This is incompetence. This is malfeasance to create a war environment in which there are going to be so many people caught in the crossfire. One thing you see about politicians the world over, once they take a position, they never apologize. They never admit they're wrong. You know, the best you can hope for is they'll just stop talking about it. That's kind of our situation here. I was at the Aspen Security Forum in July because I knew that Blinken was going to be there and a lot of the other Biden administration luminaries were going to be there. And I wanted to hear in an unfiltered environment, you know, whatever it is they would have to say, hoping to shed some light on what they really think about all of this. And all I got was the same narrative I could have gotten, you know, on TV. They're saying their script, Russia lost this war before it started. Ukraine is going to win. It's just a matter of time. This is all utter nonsense. It's not based on reality. It's merely aspirational. But people are dying over this political calculus. I think Putin's big mistake was in making assumptions about the rationality of these political decisions being made by Western leaders. This was not rational. This was an eminently negotiable, resolvable conflict, unless you wanted the conflict. And they appear to have wanted the conflict. And that's why, I thought it was very interesting in Vilnius that they end up saying, no, Ukraine, you can't join NATO now. No. You'll have to go through our process. We've got a few hoops for you. Unspecified conditions will have to be met before you can join NATO. Let's translate that into English. You're involved in a conflict. One of our bylaws says you can't join NATO if you're involved in a conflict. You have to end the conflict before you can join NATO. Well, that's catch-22, because this conflict now is never going to end. In fact, that's what provoked the war in the first place, because Putin knew that if he didn't invade Ukraine, they were going to join NATO. Okay, now he'd have 10 times. So he's either going to fight a small war he couldn't lose, or wait for the bigger war he couldn't win. He doesn't want a war with NATO. Okay, and believe me, NATO doesn't want a war with him. Okay, that's a lose-lose situation. And that isn't an altogether an unacceptable outcome from a Russian perspective. The Russians have created a 900-mile line of defensive fortifications, looks like a reverse C, generally following the Dnieper River, all the way from Belarus down to Kherson. Now, that gap between those entrenched fortifications, by the way, we're talking about tank traps, we're talking about no end of barriers to slow down and obstruct an attacking force. This is an artillery war, first and foremost. The Ukrainians are going through 900,000 155 millimeter shells a month. 900,000 shells. I don't know what they're shooting at, but the Russians are shooting 10 times that much. Okay, and they're not in any danger of running out of ammunition. Now, what's between that Maginot Line and the Dnieper River is something they're calling a security zone. I call it a death zone. It's filled with mines, okay, overhead surveillance, more tank traps, more kinds of anti-personnel things. It's just a nightmare. And that's what stalled the Ukrainian counteroffensive in June and July. They can't get through that at all. They've lost all the equipment that they've tried to send, the troops that they've tried to send. They've had to back out completely of doing that. And now they're reduced to what are nothing more than tactical pinpricks. They're forcing the Ukrainians to be on the offense to try and recapture land that they can't recapture while being on the defense. And that turns this into a war of attrition, into a war of sustainability. They're not going anywhere. This is going to be going on for decades.
So the question is, isn't it possible the best chance that Zelensky has is to draw NATO in? And then, and that's the only way he's going to have a chance to basically defeat the Russians. And
well, NATO's not. NATO's not going to do that. Okay, so there isn't any chance in the world that NATO is going to allow themselves to get sucked into this conflict, and Putin is not going to do anything foolish, as Prigozhin might have suggested, that would give NATO good cause to do so. There's factions within NATO. They're much more aggressive about this than some of the other countries who, Turkey, for example, has been, hoping to play a role in finding a resolution to the conflict, preventing it from happening in the first place. I think what happened is everybody played each other. I think Zelensky was playing NATO. NATO was playing Zelensky. Biden was playing both. Zelensky's not a villain here. I think he's a brave and courageous leader, and is a symbol for his country. I blame Blinken. I blame Biden. Okay, they're the ones that were blowing in his ear, offering him all kinds of goodies. Which he interpreted, he took seriously. You hear a guy like Biden tell you that he has your back, and you're gonna win. We're totally behind you. Well, that's political claptrap. I find these F-16s to be an interesting topic. That now we're going to send F-16s. Seriously, what do you think F-16s are going to do in Ukraine? I mean, exactly. Tell me about the battle plan for employing F-16s in Ukraine. Because I think what's going to happen is those F-16s are never going to show up, number one. And number two, if they did show up, it'd be a disaster for the United States, because the Russians are going to shoot those F-16s down. We're talking 900 miles of defenses. We're talking S-400 batteries hidden in all kinds of places and not hidden, okay, designed to, entrap you by confusing you about what their counter tactics are going to be on a strike. They're going to get shot down. But even if you had them, you couldn't take out those fortifications.
We're going to the election year next year, okay? And, Biden's approval rating is at 42%, okay? Despite the fact the economy is doing okay, there's no doubt that, you now have a growing contingency on the Republican side that's becoming increasingly vocal against the war. On the left, I don't tell you Robert Kennedy Jr. is against the war, because at the end of the day, this is about a political calculus. I mean, for the Democratic Party, for people like Blinken, Newland and Biden and so on and so forth, who got us into this basically war. How do you think this election is going to change basically their determination to keep this war going for as long as it can? I mean, is there any chance they might cut basically Zelensky loose at a certain point? What do you think that this point is too, they're so basically mired in this war that they cannot basically cut Ukraine loose without taking a beating themselves in a very big way, especially what it means for U.S. prestige and hegemony going forward?
This year is essentially coming to an end as far as the war in Ukraine goes. It's already August. Nothing's going on of any significance. More pinpricks, more suicide missions, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, we're sending $1 billion a week to or two. It's hard to know what the truth is in that, but $1 billion or $2 billion a week to Ukraine is their stipend. I mean, this is serious money we're sending to keep them afloat. And Europe is going to have a very bad winter. Germany, in particular, is going to have a very bad winter. They were getting 40% of their energy, I believe, from Nord Stream, and now that's been replaced by the United States providing LNG, but it's not going to be enough. They were getting a lot more. They're going to need a lot more energy than they can get their hands on. They've already had cut back on their industrial capacity. A lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of recession going on in Europe. Things are going to get worse economically in Europe the longer this goes on.
The House of Representatives returns to Washington on September 12th. They have to basically, pass 12 bills in order to prevent a government shutdown on October 1st. There's going to be a huge fight over spending in 2024. The fiscal year starts on October 1st. So
that's right.
If you look at actually even the agreement they signed, a couple of months ago after the debt ceiling basically prices, essentially the 2024 fiscal spending is going to be capped at the 2023 level. So there's not going to be any room to basically send more money to Ukraine unless they're going to take away from Americans. Okay. So, Social Security checks and so on and so forth. Interest payments on US debt this quarter, my projection is going to hit $1 trillion annualized rates. Yeah. So my point here is, again, I'm just trying to basically think, what going to election year, if you're Biden, you basically cut your losses and basically said, you know what, tell China, please get a deal with Russia, and basically you throw Zelensky the dog, or that you keep you're trying to keep upping support and get this war going and trying to paint basically Putin more and more as a monster that's going to basically invade Europe next and so on and so forth.
Honestly, I think America is aching to move on and get past this political stalemate we're in between the left and the right, which is doing a disservice, to the country. The Ukraine thing is going to be a sideshow. We're going to hear less and less about it. You're going to start hearing the Biden administration talk about, they've decided to stop fighting. They've decided that they want to save lives. They want to work on, doing something for their population besides killing them. And basically it's Zelensky's problem. It's Zelensky's war. It's not our war. We were here to support freedom and democracy. Right?
I personally think that, what they're staking, what people like Blinken and Newland, Biden inadvertently or not, they're putting the whole entire U.S. hegemony at stake here. Whatever happens this war, I think the world is going to look at the United States very differently. On that note, Stephen, it's been incredible to have you on the show, and I learned a great deal. I'm sure our audience will as well. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, appreciate it.
Have a great.
If you got something out of this program, please hit like and subscribe to my free YouTube channel. Let me know what you think by posting your comments on the video. If you want to learn more about my investment strategy, come visit us at davidwunbound.com.